Hi guys, and welcome back to another episode of the In the Hub podcast, brought to you by Playbox Technology UK. This is the final part of our two-part series on the future of sports broadcasting. We'll be speaking to Bruce Devlin to discuss how exciting new technologies are shaping the future of how audiences consume sport. Bruce, also known as Mr. MXF and host of Bruce's Shorts, is the Standards Vice President at Sumpty. Hope you enjoy. So, welcome back to the podcast, Bruce. I felt like we needed to kind of bring you on for this episode. We're going to talk about some of the kind of technical things involved within sports broadcasting. And obviously, you've had an episode with us before where you've talked about formats and file formats and things like that in broadcasting.
Indeed.
But just to kind of briefly recap for some of the listeners who maybe haven't caught up on that episode yet, how did you actually come to be involved in broadcasting?
Well, it started way back in the sort of, the post-Jurassic period, I think the 1980s, when I left university, had the choice of going and designing missiles or joining the BBC. So I joined the BBC, and that seemed like a really good place to go and learn about technology. And I was in their research department back in the mid-80s.
It was quite a choice you faced at that point, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was interesting with it. Back in those days, we were still fighting physics. We didn't quite have processors that we could do everything in software. So the interesting areas in physics were video processing and cruise missiles. And I didn't really fancy the latter, so video processing won.
I was going to say, hopefully you've kind of never looked back from that decision.
Well, you say that, but I designed MXF, and that gets stuck into airborne platforms. Once you design these children, you can't control what they do with their lives. They run off and they do whatever they want. It's terrible.
Yeah. So Bruce, what about kind of sports broadcasting? Has that kind of always been a point of interest for you? I know in obviously in your spare time, you're credited with winning a few triathlons. Is that something that's always been a point of interest for you, or is it just kind of part of the job?
No, it absolutely has. When I was at the BBC, one of the projects that I was on was designing radio camera antennas. And so even to this day, you'll see some fit cameramen running up and down the sidelines of sports, football pitches and the like, with kind of like a yogurt pot on a stick on the end of it. And I kind of helped the R&D team at the BBC bring those into existence and get rid of some of the radio frequency issues then. And I was absolutely fascinated, and the chance to get out and actually, do sports, but do it professionally was just fantastic. It was really good fun, really enjoyed it. And I always vowed that at some stage I'd get back into it.
Yes. Yeah. And I was just going to say, we can't talk about kind of standards in broadcasting and just simply not include sports broadcasting. I think along with news coverage, it's arguably kind of one of those hallmarks and a major saving grace of linear TV. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. And just to mention standards, if any of these any listeners have not actually been to a sports broadcast, next time you're somewhere where there is a truck or something like that, just have a look at the total number of connections and bits of wire and cabling and the number of different companies around. The reason you need standards is each one of those different companies and each one of those cables needs to hit half a dozen standards just so that their kit plugs into all the other bits in the infrastructure. It would be a total nightmare without standards, and it's difficult enough with standards.
Exactly. And obviously with sports broadcasting, sports in general, live sports, obviously it's such a massive part of a lot of people's lives, massive part of the kind of way they consume entertainment. Obviously, like you were saying there, the sheer amount of cabling, the sheer amount of kind of infrastructure that's involved, it obviously means broadcasting live sport can often be quite a stressful kind of endeavour. How have you personally seen broadcast technology evolve over recent years to make that kind of less stressful?
I've figured out how they've made it more cost effective. I'm not sure it's got any less stressful, though. I think there's a certain level of stress that is tolerated, and you spend enough money until you reach that level and then stop. Yeah. So one of the really interesting things is that, back in the 80s and 90s, if you went to a major sporting event, you basically put your entire production force on a plane, flew them out, and you rented enough hotels to bankrupt a small city in order to do your sports broadcast. But now with the reduction in cost of backhaul feeds and an awful lot more fiber in the ground, in other words, to get rid of the latency of going over one or two satellite hops, you can now backhaul an awful lot of stuff and keep your production crews largely at base and backhaul as much of the signaling as you possibly can, and have stuff that's live-ish. It might be a little bit delayed, but you've traded off a phenomenal amount of cost by shipping all of your crews out, and you're now doing a lot of the work with the kit that you've invested in, that the people have been trained on. You're not having to do anything special. So an awful lot of sports broadcasting is now becoming do the exotic stuff on site, backhaul as much as you can, and do stuff with the infrastructure that's stable, working, and has been tested, and you don't have to stick on a plane, fly out, and hope it gets there.
Yeah. And in your kind of personal experience, Bruce, who is to blame for mistakes in terms of live sports broadcasting and stuff like that? Is it the kind of people or the technology?
It's a tough one, really. The technology often breaks in new and interesting ways that people don't expect.
Yes, yeah.
And in some ways, the reduction in spend in some of the sports broadcasting has meant that there used to be armies of backup teams who'd be running around with spare bits of cable, being able to plug things in. And very often those backup teams aren't there anymore, because the kit in some ways is more reliable than it's ever been. And when stuff goes wrong, it's usually something that nobody's thought of. I was talking to a friend of mine who mentioned that one of the sports broadcasts for them that really went down was an IP sports broadcast, and the failure was actually that most of the Eastern Seaboard's DNS went down. And when you're entirely dependent on the public internet to provide private feeds, when all of that went down, there's pretty much nothing they could do. They were kind of left sunk. So, we're finding new ways to destroy the world every day that we haven't thought of before.
Yeah, I almost think that's a good thing in a way. Obviously, it's going to try and future-proof us, but like you said, there's always going to be things that go wrong, aren't there? Whether that be people or technology. I
was just going to mention, in terms of people, one of the things that keeps getting said to me as I go around, particularly talking about IP infrastructures, whether they're standardized ST2110s or they're NDIs or whatever, a lot of it comes down to training. If you've got well-trained staff who are knowledgeable in the dynamics of a sports broadcast, because by definition, sports is unpredictable. If you're familiar with how the kit works and you can cope with unpredictable events without getting flustered or panicky, back to your stress thing, training counts for a lot. And the regret that I often hear said from people who've had crises on air is that if only they'd done more training, they wouldn't have had that problem. So invest in that training. It really does make a difference.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, try and future-proof yourself, essentially. And yeah.
Indeed.
So when things do go wrong, you kind of have a semblance of what to actually do.
A semblance. I like that word. I'm going to use that in my next training course.
Brilliant. I'll look out for that, Bruce. So yeah, I wanted to touch on kind of virtual reality and augmented reality as well. I read a few articles recently. It seems to be quite a hotly debated topic when it comes to live sports and the kind of impact that those two technologies will have on live sport. Do you kind of personally think that there is a future for these technologies in sports viewing? I could kind of picture myself maybe in the living room with a kind of VR headset on, trying to picture myself in this kind of 3D sports environment, watching it live. But in my mind, I'm not quite there yet. I can't quite comprehend kind of what that would be like. What do you kind of think of those two technologies?
Well, I think there's two ways it could go. One is the purely creative aspect of it. So I'm a big Olympics fan. Personally, as you say, I do triathlons and cycle, and I used to be a springboard diver. And one of the things that I think they did really well at the Olympics was the virtual camera views, where they had lots and lots of cameras in the stadium, and they would do a virtual flyover of, say, the pommel horse. By synthesizing camera views that were never there, because there was never a camera there, but with enough different angles, they could recreate the objects and do a virtual flyover. And some of them worked really well. Typically the ones where they tried to simulate a frame rate of about 20 or 30 frames per second. And some of them worked really terribly. And that's when the simulated frame rate was down at sort of 4 or 5 frames per second. So from a creative perspective, I can see that as that sort of technology becomes more cost effective, in other words, static rigging of lots of cheap cameras is just going to happen. I can see that creatively that'll be good. But I also think there's a role for the augmented reality. And I think this might actually happen in stadium before it happens at home. So if in stadium you can hold up your phone and not just see the action, but actually see, when the commentators highlight a certain play or something going on, if you were to hold your phone in front of your face and see that, there's something interesting happening here, and you get the pundit commentating visually live while you're watching the game from your camera angle, that people would pay for that. People would pay $5. And if you've got enough thousand people paying $5 for that, it'll happen. Definitely happen.
Yeah. I can actually picture myself doing that, and if you're that kind of involved in it, and you're a proper sports fan, getting your phone out, being able to kind of scan the stadium, having a prompt there, and it shows you even stats and for boxing tail of the tape and stuff like that.
Yeah,
I think that'd be an absolutely kind of brilliant addition to what's already a really exciting event, basically.
Yeah. I do pity the poor marshals who have to break up the fights because somebody's just jammed their iPhone into the left ear of some hulking brute standing next to them. But, it's going to happen. It'll be fine.
There's definitely going to be some issues there.
There's going to be some issues.
And then out of kind of all of the future developments, the ones that we've obviously mentioned and the ones that we haven't, so things like obviously 8K and VR and AR and things like that. Which one do you personally think is going to be the most exciting prospect for sports broadcasting going forward?
I think high dynamic range, well done.
Yeah.
And I say that just because when you're there in real life watching the golf ball sail into the air, it's only the high dynamic range of your eyeballs that lets you see the ball. Now, if we get high dynamic range really done well for sports, the engagement and the immersion is going to be awesome. And it doesn't matter how far away you are from your screen. It doesn't really matter what the sport is, but high dynamic range just brings that extra element of realism. And things are getting a lot better. And when I see a good HDR sports broadcast, it's just stunning.
Yes, yeah.
But I think actually that will be the one that continues to grow the audiences and really gets that engagement.
Yeah, 100%. I think the formula's there, isn't it, for sports? I think we've got to a point where most sports broadcasts are really engaging. There's nothing that I'd really pick out as being, really stand out and turns me off or anything like that.
Yeah.
Unless, of course, there's those kind of spontaneous issues that crop up. But like you said, I think it's a point now of just upgrading what we're seeing to a point where, it almost feels like we are there when we're not.
Yeah.
Which I think will be the next kind of elevation.
I will add one more little cherry onto that particular engagement cake.
Go on, Bruce.
Which is immersive sound.
Yes. Yeah.
I think on Monday there's going to be a Kit Plus TV episode where I talk about how they wired the whole of the or many of the arenas at the Olympic Games for immersive sound, so that you had a vertical element as well as the spatial element. So anybody who's wired their sitting room for that spatial sound would have had a fantastic experience from the Olympics. It's not quite as good as it would have been if there'd been crowds there. I think that might have made the engagement slightly better. But I think for those who've invested in good soundbar technology, or even put vertical speakers into the ceiling in their sitting rooms or wherever they're watching their TV, I think if that starts to catch on, I think that will take HDR and really crank the level of engagement up, particularly when you've got big stadiums with lots of people singing and shouting. That really makes a difference. But you do have to invest in your home for that to make a difference.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, I think the people who really do value that kind of thing, they will, take that extra mile and invest that money, won't they? And hopefully it will pay off. So in just one word, Bruce, what do you envision for the future of the sports broadcasting industry? So I know we've asked you this question about the kind of wider broadcasting industry. We've had a couple of months now since we last spoke to you. What do you kind of envision for the future of sports broadcasting in one word?
Engagement.
Love it.
Anything that just gets the pulse racing and gets you into the sport and allows you to forget that there's a screen and speakers and somebody shouting at you or the phone's ringing. Anything that just dissolves you into the moment. And that includes being in the venue. That's what it's all about.
Yep. No, 100% agree. Do you ever think there'll be a point where some diehard fans, they might have been going to stadiums in person for most of their life following a team? Do you ever think there'll be a point where they think, there's really no point me going to the stadium, I could just stay at home and do this?
I don't think so, because I think there's something about, particularly when you're in a stadium, when the volume reaches a level of everybody singing or shouting where you can actually feel it in your rib cages. I don't think you'll ever recreate that at home, not without your neighbours issuing a restraining order or turning your volume down. So I don't think anything beats that live shared experience. But I think it'll get close.
Yeah, 100%. I completely agree with that. I think there is that kind of nature to us as humans, isn't it? That no matter how far we progress with technology, I don't think anything will ever replicate that. And that's how we like it. So, Bruce, obviously, thank you for joining me today, helping me out with some of those questions. Are there any kind of exciting plans in the pipeline for you or Pt.2 or Mr. MXF that you can talk to us about today?
It's a couple of exciting things. Pt.2's just kicked off a thing called Rapid Industry Solutions, which is kind of an experiment, really, to put together a group of people who are specialists in a particular area to try and figure out what the yellow brick road to the future looks like. And the first of these is on virtualized production. And so I think there's about 30 odd companies we've got together. About 50-50 sort of America and the rest of the world, looking at the deep tech of virtual production, whether it's LED walls or colorimetry, health and safety, all those kinds of things that you need. There's lots of moving parts to that problem, and we're trying to figure out, how do we write best practices? Who needs to get involved so that we can actually make the world of virtual production more slick and more interoperable? So that's the first one. And then from the Mr. MXF point of view, I'm trying to put together a bunch of open source free tools that help end customers communicate with the vendors of products more effectively. Because what I've figured out is the products are getting more complicated. The vendors don't have time to learn it. And so if there was a way to try and just help express the vocabulary of file-based workflows, which is my specialty, or even live-based workflows, if I can help people do that, then I think there'll be better engagement between the people selling tools and the people buying tools. And actually we'll get more interoperability and better stuff. And part of that is doing my Bruce's Shorts video series, which I'm doing a few this year, but I'll be picking up a lot more next year and doing about 2 a month, something like that.
Yeah, 100%, Bruce. You're always on the move, aren't you? And I love seeing what you're doing over on LinkedIn and things like that. I love catching up on what you're doing. It's essentially all tying into trying to make the broadcast technology industry a better place, isn't it, basically?
If I can just get people to enjoy even the boring bits of their jobs, I'll take that as a win.
That's brilliant, Bruce. And how can people get in touch with you if they want to inquire about anything?
Best place is my website, mrmxf.com. You can find me on Twitter and LinkedIn, but mrmxf.com, you get the latest updates of what I've been doing. There's a contact form in there. And there's some interesting videos and stuff to learn about.
Brilliant stuff. So thank you so much, Bruce. Really do appreciate it.
Thank you, Neil. Always fun talking to you.
Speak to you soon.
Cheers.